Happy Halloween, everyone! Another October is upon us, that time when the fall season goes into full swing with pumpkin spice lattes, sweater weather, decorations, candy, Halloween specials, and my personal favorite, in film, horror represents many shapes and ideas throughout our lives. It takes on many forms, from a monster lurking within the darkness or something that defies any physical monstrosity. Its ominous presence creates a haunting wake-up call that the world isn't just a happy-go-lucky playground. This frightening world exposes us as deeply vulnerable people, but accepting and overcoming our fears leaves us feeling braver and stronger. In fact, the monsters themselves aren't the scariest to comprehend. All the monsters and boogie people on film only exacerbate what we truly fear, and what we can no longer simply ignore. As the video game Hellblade puts it, we're all like children scared of the dark, making up monsters to fill the void. That doesn't make them real. We made them real. But none of you came here for a philosophy lecture, no. It's a top 10 list. In my mind, these are the 10 films that still affect me in the most haunting or spookiest of ways. Before I share my list though, here are 5 honorable mentions that almost made the cut in no particular order. The horror genre is always obligated to innovate the slasher genre at least once a generation. Ridley Scott's sci-fi original Alien is no exception, as the film reminds us how profoundly terrifying the unseeable is. At the time of its release, no one knew from where the xenomorph truly came, its motivation, or for what greater purpose it was conceived in the first place. This is the strength of its Lovecraftian horror, if not classic sci-fi. It relishes in the terror of what's out there beyond our reach. Could this thing be friendly? Not even close. And that simple answer is enough to keep me awake for a few nights more. Before bringing Marvel's Spider-Man to life from the comics in 2002, writer-director Sam Raimi's macabre delight still feels as fresh as ever. I already talked about the sequel in another video before, so I'll keep this brief. Even with shoestring budgets, Raimi turns what looks like schlocky terror into a funhouse of blood, guts, and gore, where most horror filmmakers focus on empty jump scares, obvious CGI, insufferable plots, empty bloodshed. Evil Dead 1 and 2 play along with their nightmarish scenarios with such a giddiness that it's a wonder that most horror films nowadays aren't this playful with their terror. They're simply some of the most violent episodes of the Three Stooges never committed to film.
Groovy.
Much like Evil Dead, Raimi retains his goofiness and his horror sensibilities. This time, however, he goes all out with his trademark insanity and makes Drag Me to Hell as much as a morbidly hilarious slapstick comedy as a deliciously horrific B-movie. In this film, Raimi proves himself as no stranger to the accustomed ritual of awaiting the death of the blonde damsel. Raimi tortures Christine in a hopelessly innocent and engaging performance by Alison Lohman, thinking, now that's a lovely young woman with a perfect life ahead of her. We should fix that. In doing so, Drag Me to Hell has terror that made me scream, wriggle, and laugh my ass off. Screw you, William Friedkin. Eternal Damnation is hilarious. Though The Nightmare Before Christmas is widely considered a classic among dark fantasy films, if not among Halloween and Christmas films, Henry Selick's 2009 animated gem Coraline is easily the closest to my heart out of all of his works. As Laika's first great animated feature, thus leading into Paranorman and Kubo and the Two Strings, Selick helps introduce the studio's strengths in taking young audiences seriously in its raw and honest themes. Instead of a frantic, loud, goofy ride, Coraline patiently unravels its dark mystery of the otherworld with fantastical wonders and a tender reassurance that life may seem mundane, but the grass is always greener and less scary on the other side. Writer-director Ari Aster's viscerally unnerving follow-up to Hereditary spares none of its nearly 2.5 hours of existential dread devouring us to the neck up. In fact, it actually surprises me just how few horror films take place during the day like this one. If anything, it makes the festivities and the violence feel even more terrifying than at night. The authentic performances from Florence Pugh and the rest of the cast make this story about a decaying relationship thrust within an ominously cheerful festival feel surprisingly real. Watching Midsommar felt like that there's something inexplicably painful going on, but the film forcefully coerces me into smiling along, which makes the explosive climax feel all the more devastating yet eerie all at once. The good news is that there are plenty of reliefs of dark comedy that balance out the tension from becoming boring and inevitable. The only reservation I have with this film is that once the plot moves into the festival, I feel like that the decay of the central relationship kind of falls by the sidelines compared to other side plots. I wish there was just a little more time focused on the fallout of the relationship. Well, I was happy to find out that the director's cut of the film totally rectifies this problem. In this version, the fallout of the relationship unravels to uncomfortable perfection, making the film end on an even more disgustingly effective note. And even at nearly 3 hours, I consider that the best way to watch the story unfold. So, with that out of the way, on to the top 10. If this list ranks my go-to films to watch over Halloween, George A. Romero's Creepshow would easily top my list. Even in this one, the film finds itself in welcome company at the number 10 spot. Comprised as 5 horrific tales about revenge and retribution, none of this should ever come together, yet they beautifully work. While the film favors pulpy scares over quiet dread, it embraces the former with a comic book style unlike any other horror film I've seen. Similar to Drag Me to Hell, Creepshow subjects its characters to one darkly hilarious terror after another, from relatives beyond the grave to killer grass and an overdue uprising by cockroaches. The 80s has had its rich share of carnival-esque horror films, and this is by far my personal favorite. The idea of speculative fiction dabbling into the real world's turmoils traces all the way back to the days of Rod Serling, if not further. Under the exhilarating debut of writer-director Jordan Peele, Get Out terrified and amused me with the reality that the self-proclaimed freedom fighters of the world are sometimes the bad guys too. Films concerning about race easily paint racial dynamics in black and white heroes and villains, yet Peele expertly pulls behind the curtain of another unlikely monster, the left-wing racists who secretly tokenize minorities for power. It's with this that Peele's clever satire actually makes the horror even scarier than deflates such, with Brian Tyree Henry being a major comic standout. Daniel Kaluuya's incredible performance also makes for such a complex character and drives the film's stark message. Of course racists are horrible people, but an equally scary monster lies in the people who pretend to support you, but ultimately assimilate your identity out of oppression. It's with this that Get Out proves that the best horror films show just how regular people can be just as scary as monsters.
Get out! Yo! Yeah! Yo, chill, man. Get out! Chill! Chill, man! Chill! Get the fuck out of here!
Much in the vein of Rosemary's Baby, Ari Aster's startling writing and directorial debut in Hereditary elevates the tragic story of a demonic secret eating away at a family from darkly sinister to sheerly upsetting. The film belongs to the amazing Toni Collette in her disturbing performance as the mother who's fallen victim to a series of predetermined events. Aster immediately proves himself as a potentially new master of horror with the film's gorgeous cinematography, shooting and framing scenes like meticulous paintings, and atmosphere that evokes overwhelming doom and despair. Even before the major turning point of the film, through one of the most terrifying moments of recent cinema, Hereditary never stops the brakes of domestic pandemonium until its disquieting final minutes. Funnily enough, while the most terrifying horror films can involve the supernatural, they're never truly there. Or are they? Is it real, or do they just come from our minds? As for myself, the imagination makes anything we see and imagine feel real. Mr. Babadook doesn't seem especially real, but I fear he does. Writer-director Jennifer Kent herself cleverly dodges this obvious question and instead tackles a bigger one. How does a single mother and her son cope with the death in the family? The unnerving breakdown that unfolds suggests that Mr. Babadook has no place here, but that's where Kent proves this query wrong. The Babadook isn't terrifying because of the monster's actions or lack thereof, but how his presence alone wildly manifests all the grief and anguish banging from underneath the floorboards. When it first came out, audiences were disappointed that they didn't get a creature feature. Thankfully, I don't give a shit about those, and that helped me take a closer look that completely defies such a simplistic label. The Babadook is at its best as a darkly thoughtful character study of coping with a death in the family that feels like being haunted by a monster. The only image more nightmarish than a horrifying performance from Essie Davis as the damaged widow is Noah Wiseman's equally unsettling performance as her disturbed child. At first I thought the resolution was silly, but it did get scarier the more I thought about it. People can and do overcome trauma, but it never fully goes away. It continues its dormant existence within the darkest corner of our minds with no telling when it'll strike next. Only in the comfort and support of our loved ones can we only drive the pain back into the darkness. And it's with this newfound appreciation for its ending that only deepened my love for this masterful horror film. If you do plan on watching it, please go in knowing as little as possible. Mr. Babadook will thank you for it. Echoing Raimi's filmmaking sensibilities, comedy and horror are actually two halves of the same coin. And if that's the case, I wouldn't be surprised if director Edgar Wright turned that up to 11 while co-writing this dynamic screenplay with the film's co-star Simon Pegg. Shaun of the Dead, the first in Wright's Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy, is so much more than a hilarious send-up of George A. Romero's zombie films. It's also a sharp romantic comedy that showcases Wright's greatest strengths as a director with electrifying film editing, brilliant jokes, and a violently imaginative narrative that proves that all rom-coms need are a little more zombies.
Yeah, boy!
All jokes aside, nearly 50 years later, Friedkin's original classic, based on William Peter Blatty's novel, is still a real terror. For all the possession films that this film influenced for the years to come, something that The Exorcist still has over its descendants is its chilling plausibility. Even if you don't hold religious or spiritual beliefs such as myself, the performances from Ellen Burstyn and Linda Blair bring this mother-daughter relationship to life with such emotional honesty. Once Pazuzu possesses Regan, the film loses not 1 ounce of tension or depth, as the performances from Max von Sydow and Jason Miller as the respective old and young priests carry on the holy struggle towards a breathless climax.
The power of Christ compels you! The power of Christ compels you!
Robert Vina's silent horror classic from 1920 paves the way for every iconic horror aesthetic for the 100 years of horror films to follow. Haunting atmosphere, an insane scientist, an ominous monster, and Tim Burton's go-to aesthetic, German Expressionism. Whether silent or talking, there doesn't seem to exist any other horror film like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. While many films of the genre do a terrific job of evoking a nightmarish atmosphere, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is the nightmare from beginning to end. It's said that the director made this film as a cautionary tale about the rise of fascism, as Vina actually fled Germany during the rise of the Third Reich. So I guess you could say that even today's horror films with political themes like They Live and the Purge series owe at least something to this film. The set design especially complements this feeling of dread and disorientation, and it's clever that the film actually unravels as a frame narrative, as the angular and distorted architecture of the sets further enhances the overall mood of the film. A living living nightmare where the boogeyman has everyone in their iron grip. All silent films feel like dreams, but how appropriate is it that one of the best ones encompasses the eerie landscape of a waking nightmare? Take that, Freddy! While a lot of non-cinephiles may not recognize this film, its influence among slasher films is still felt. Before Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, or hell, even Norman Bates, there was Michael Powell's 1960 masterpiece Peeping Tom. Critically reviled upon release, to the point it nearly destroyed the director's career, but later revitalized as a classic, Peeping Tom single-handedly invents the slasher genre with such gruesome attention to detail of which only the master of suspense can dream. Where contemporary slasher films make us fear for the victims, only to die at the killer's hands, Powell has the gross audacity to indulge Mark Lewis, the film's killer and protagonist. Yes, you read that correctly. Something more disturbing than Carl Bohm's performance as Lewis are the kills themselves. Something as simple as Lewis's trusty camera panning into a poor victim's face as it morphs from rapt attention to frozen terror haunts me more than any other serial killer on film. And for all the films that celebrate filmmaking as a euphoric endeavor, here's one that daringly deconstructs one as a disturbingly violent act of control. While Powell started the slasher genre with a bang, director Alfred Hitchcock perfects it at its artistic peak with Psycho. While Norman Bates is the concrete villain of the film, iconically conceived of by Anthony Perkins, there are hardly any heroes within the film that is Hitchcock's beautifully constructed psychological labyrinth. The death of Marion Crane remains one of the scariest moments in all of celluloid, not only for Bernard Herrmann's legendary score, but for how it stands as one of the film's many instances of breaking early cinema's golden rules one step at a time. Hitchcock was coming off of the massive success of North by Northwest, another Hitchcock masterpiece to see if you haven't already, but film executives hated this immoral sounding premise, so they turned him away. So he offered to use his crew off of his show Alfred Hitchcock Presents, but even then the studio still didn't like it, leading Hitch to independently finance Psycho himself. At the end of the day, they just didn't want a story as dangerous as it sounded on the silver screen. Long story short, the rest was history. Innocent and beautiful blonde? Nope. Not only is she as icy as Hitchcock usually fashions them, but she's unassuming right from the start. Everyone must be clothed while making love? Bodies. Naked bodies everywhere. We gotta see the character through the end? Yeah, right. Stay out of the bathroom? Did I stutter? We must never question the evil of our villains? Please! Here's a scene where you actually feel concerned whether or not Bates could erase his evidence of his murder. You see what I mean? While it was critically mixed upon its release for its said transgressions, the unprecedented success of the box office, including an audacious campaign that locked you out of the screening if you're late, forced a revaluation onto the film into the masterpiece we now know it today. Despite the redundancy of the film's final twist by today's standards, Psycho remains one of the fewest horror films to elevate the genre into the highest peak of cinema. The ability to make great films within different genres is a godsend for any great director. The cinematic master himself, Stanley Kubrick, not only conquered a multitude of genres, Dr. Strangelove with comedy and 2001 with science fiction to name a few, but he also validated the innate powers of these genres as essential foundations of cinema. The Shining represents the crown testament that films of the horror genre can also become distinguished works of art. Even when Kubrick mutilates Stephen King's original novel of the same name, it's still an immaculate achievement and a wholly original experience all its own. The Shining is the go-to horror film about building a Rorschach test of dread. Are the ghosts manipulating the family? Is everyone just going insane? Could both be happening all at once? Not only do none of these questions feel absolutely answered, but the end result contradicts neither possibility, existing as both the greatest ghost story and/or the scariest psychological breakdown ever put to film. Beyond that, everyone sings its obvious but unbeatable feats. The terrifying central performances, the revolutionary cinematography through immersive dolly and steadicam shots, the unnerving score, and the labyrinthine narrative all shroud The Shining in a dense mystery that unravels to insanity in the best possible way. And despite ambiguities, The Shining still feels like a wholly complete film about how unresolved family tensions implode in on themselves piece by ghostly piece. It's with this that Kubrick has concocted a modern Caligari, a cinematic nightmare that firmly roots itself in its own world with an unspeakable darkness that only ages like a bloody glass of wine. And for all these reasons and more, I consider The Shining the greatest horror film ever committed to cinema. So those are the horror films that I hold to the highest standard. But what are some of your favorite horror films? Leave your picks in the comments section down below, and while you're at it, hit that like button, share this video, subscribe to my channel, and ring the bell so you'll know when I post my future videos. And you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at FilmGeekDave, as well as my Letterboxd account for all the other films I watch during my free time. That's all for today, and I'll see you next time.